Welcome to this MIFF Talks event at the 66th Melbourne International Film Festival. It's a bit sad that it's all ending, but we've got a riveting discussion coming up. So do prick your ears, and we'll be chatting about cool things. I'm just going to introduce the panelists. I asked them for short bios because I'm sure you've read their long bios. I'm going to go closest to furthest. Jennifer Mills is the fiction editor at Overlands and the author of 2 novels, Gone and The Diamond Anchor, and the short story collection The Rest Is Wait. Her next novel, Dyschronia, is out with Picador in February. Ben C. Lucas is an award-winning Australian director and writer with a background in game design and formal education in ancient history. His debut feature film, Wasted on the Young, screened at Sydney Film Fest and various international festivals, and his second feature, Other Life, which I saw last night and is brilliant, go see it, is due for release in November this year. Claire Corbett is a writer and teaches literature, creative writing, and film. Her first novel, When We Have Wings, is science fiction about humans genetically engineered to fly. Her second novel, Watch Over Me, has been called a dystopia. Alex Heller-Nicholas is a film critic on Triple R, an editor at the journal Senses of Cinema, and has written 4 books on cult, horror, and exploitation cinema. And I'm Adolfo. I edit the film magazine Metro, among other publications, and I also write and speak and dance, but no one really minds who I am. I'm just asking questions. So I'm also very, very lovely and funny. So we're here to talk about dystopia on film. And I guess the way, from our discussions via email before this and over dinner and in the green room, I guess for me, what we're kind of going to be teasing out is 3 things, really. The what of a dystopia, what is its function, what is it for, why do we continue to watch them? Are they prophecies, or are they kind of just artistic expressions? Are they forms of catharsis? We're also going to be talking about how do we make these dystopias, how do we depict them, how do they work? And of course we'll talk about why as well. Why do we, as artists, why do we make them? As consumers, why do we keep watching them? And we keep coming back to the same texts. So those are the 3 umbrella things we'll be talking about, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end as well if you'd like to broach anything that I haven't. And yeah. So I guess just as an icebreaker, and hopefully you've prepared for this because I gave you notes. It's kind of like those at parties when you're trying to get to know people and you have those word association games. I guess we'll just go, starting from Alex this time, just maybe name a recent or your favorite dystopia.
It's not exactly recent, but one that I think that myself and a lot of people return to with constant passion, like a religion, is Chris Marker's La Jetée. Because I think it's a film that uses form as passionately as it uses narrative to present what is effectively a horror story, but without the genre trappings. I think it's an extraordinary work of art.
That's a great choice. I think La Jetée is fantastic. I was going to nominate a couple, just 2 very quickly that relate to each other. One's much older, which is Modern Times, the Charlie Chaplin film, which I think is very cognate with all the themes in Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And the other one that I would relate to that is The Matrix, which I really, really... Closer to the mic? Oh, okay. Is that better? Sorry, guys. Okay, the other one is The Matrix, which to me, so many dystopias have come from a written text that underlie them, but both Modern Times and The Matrix don't. They originated as films, and The Matrix contributes this truly original image, speaking of horror, of the baby hooked up to the computer. So it gives us a truly original image for a kind of modern dystopia, but it relates to Modern Times because of that thing of being part of the machine.
I was going to take the low road and say Logan, actually, in very recent time.
I haven't seen that.
Because I think it's kind of the end of an era. It's kind of a landmark in terms of we've done superheroes to death, and it was great to finally kind of climax that experience. We had 17 years of Wolverine. By the way, I don't think it's a great film. I don't love the film, but I think it's really.
So you like the world,
but I think it's an important sign of the times.
Yep.
We spent 17 years kind of worshipping this character Wolverine, and for that entire time he was PG rated. But his superpower was having knives for hands. And that would really mess someone up, like you're going to be dark if your superpower is I have knives for hands. What are you going to do except stab people? But Right, but also for whatever it was.
He can retract them. Just clarify.
Yeah. But for
Just a bit of
six,
fact-
for
bit of
6 or
fact-
7
Are we getting
films.
this mixed up with Edward Scissorhands? What's happening?
I
There's
don't
a
know
mashup I would love
how
to
many
see.
Wolverine films there have been. I think there's like 6 or 7 before this one. It would always be like he'd slice a chain and something would fall on someone, or it'd be like schnick to ha, cut your gun in half. It was nerfed
It's
and
very
it was
phallic.
lame. And so
yeah.
finally he was actually slicing people up, and I think that was kind of a middle finger to the superhero genre, and I respect that.
I'm going to go with a very contemporary and very Australian and I think really exciting dystopia, which is Clever Man, which is on the ABC at the moment, which I
Good choice.
I love, and I think it turns the superhero genre on its head. It turns takes the dystopia genre in a new direction for Australia, and I think it's really exciting writing and exciting performances too. I'm already glued to it.
Cool. I guess just to fully kind of lead in to our discussion, Claire, this isn't in your bio, but you did a lot of research on dystopias, and during our email conversations, you're quite specific about this notion of dystopia and how it's distinct from the notion of, say, post-apocalyptic, which we kind of often conflate or relate to it. Could you maybe just
Sure.
talk about that?
I suppose this I'm a writer, and so it takes me back, I guess, to the written form of utopia and then obviously dystopia, which distends from it. And this is a much older form even than the novel, let alone film. It takes us at least back to Plato's Republic. It's a form of philosophy to try and think about what is the ideal state or the ideal society. And then we have the evolution through books like Gulliver's Travels. And a lot of the book, which these then get filmed, which people tend to think of as the classic or dystopia, is 1984. And dystopias often turn on language. They turn on consciousness and perception of the world. And George Orwell was very, very clear that 1984 was partly inspired, very largely inspired by Gulliver's Travels, which gives you a sort of succession of different kinds of political organisation and satire. There's a lot of humour in utopia and dystopia, though it may not seem so. But the important point, to answer your question, is that dystopia is very fully worked out. It gives you a place to stand from which you look at your own society. That's its point. It's often very finely and fully worked out. It's not just a kind of explosion of the current society and everything's gone downhill. It's a lot more political and consciously worked out than that. So you get the kind of mechanisms and you get to think about how your own society works. Therefore, I don't think that post-apocalypse and dystopia are the same thing at all. You can have both in one artwork. But there's often a great pleasure for people in post-apocalypse, especially on film. There's an apocalyptic sublime, which is that, the pleasure of these powerful images of destruction or decay or wasteland. And I think it's almost a form of the id at times. It's this childish delight in, let's get rid of it all, I don't have to go to the office on Monday morning. A great example of a film like that is the New Zealand film Quiet Earth, where he gets to drive trains, and My Name is Earl did that as well. They had a Y2K episode where they thought the world had ended, and so they're racing through the supermarkets. And it's a real explosion of the id. I don't think dystopia is an explosion of the id at all. It's almost the crushing of the ego by the superego and by the demands of the society. So we could talk about films or books which include both, but they're not necessarily the same at all.
Okay, cool. Well, so, this idea of dystopia is kind of giving you a place, like having a very well thought out place from which to look at your own society is really fascinating for this panel because just a bit of insider goss. This panel actually originally was intended to be just about specifically Dead End Drive-In by Brian Trenchard Smith, which is an adaptation of a Peter Carey short story, Crabs. So we're celebrating the 45th anniversary of that publication this year. So it would have been a solely overland event on that one thing. But after some conversations with Jen and after some conversations with Claire, Overland decided to broaden out the topic of this to dystopia in general. But I guess, Jen, as someone from Overland, did you want to maybe just talk about that?
The editor of Overland contacted me months and months and months ago and was like, look, what do you think about running something with the MIFF and republishing, because I do the fiction, and what do you think about republishing Peter Carey's story from 1972? called Crabs. And so I had another read of the story. It actually ended up being the opening story in The Fat Man in History, which is the book that made Peter Carey's career take off. And to give you a bit of background, he'd been living in Melbourne. He lived overseas for a little while as well, but working in advertising in Melbourne. He wrote 3 or 4 novels before he was ever published anything. And Crabs was, I think, his 4th or 5th ever publication. It was one of his first proper literary journal publications, tied with another story he had in Meanjin in the same year. So we're talking super early career Peter Carey. And with a lot of writers, you sort of look back, certainly with my own work, you look back at the early stuff and it's a little bit oh, I don't know if this is still going to fly. I'm not sure this is still a good story. It loses its resonance or whatever. But I read Crabs again and I was instantly excited by the resonance this story has with the political moment now. I don't know if any of you saw Dead End Drive-In. That screened last week, I think. But the story is Crabs, who's Jimmy in the film, really wants to be a tow truck diver. It's this sort of post-apocalyptic Australia, it's only lightly tweaked, really, Australia. And he sort of wants to be a tow truck driver so that he can then go and earn an income salvaging car parts. But he takes Frank's car, his boss's car, to take his girlfriend to the drive-in. 2 of their wheels get stolen while they're there, and he goes to report the crime only to discover that they are trapped in this drive-in forever. The manager is very kind of relaxed about the whole situation and is sort of, you want some meal tickets, join the line, have some blankets, yep. And so you get the idea that this is something that is sort of happening, there's some kind of logic or system to it. But you're so inside Crabs's point of view that you never actually get an outside perspective of what's happening to him. And so you're always guessing, what is this place? And about 2/3 of the way through the story, it's not very long, by the way, it's probably about 10 pages long. About 2/3 of the way through the story, these Asians arrive at the drive-in.
They're not Asians in the story.
No, they are.
No, they're not. They're
people-
Indians and English. I know they're Asians in the film.
People from South Asia in the story, perhaps.
Peoples of the Empire.
I believe are Asian. But the suggestion is that this drive-in theatre has also become something of a refugee camp or a camp for unwanted immigration. And then there is set up this, it's much more played out in the film than it is in the story, but there's set up this sort of opposition between underclass white Australians with no hope and new arrivals who are perceived as stealing our, if not jobs, then wheels of our Chevys. And so there's this really interesting contemporary resonance, I think, in this story. And I won't give away the ending because you'll all be able to read it when we republish it in the next issue of Overland in a couple of months' time. But as part of that republication, I had the opportunity of interviewing Peter Carey, and so that interview will also be published in the magazine. Not in the issue that is currently out, but the next one that's coming in a couple of months' time. So that's a bit of background. Yeah. Do you want to go on? Should I go on?
No, if you'd like. Otherwise...
I just want to say, I'm not trying to be difficult there. I think it's interesting because the story was published in 1972. Mm-hmm. So that's why, yes, they're Asian, but he specifically says Indian and English. And that's the only reason I pointed out is because the film's so interesting because, of course, it's post-Vietnamese boat people. So it just moves it on. I think the themes are absolutely there. And as you say, they are definitely picked up a lot more in the film. That's the only reason I said that, is that it's just interesting to see that evolution of how it's applicable to what's happening.
I think to be fair, in the story, there's subtle indicators of people from various backgrounds arriving.
That's true.
So there's also there's a wonderful moment where he lifts up the bonnet of somebody's car to try and steal, I think, the carby from them, and inside finds a family of chickens. And so there's this wonderful sort of little hobo camp set up happening, and it's all very ad hoc. But because you only get Krabs's point of view, you sort of get the sights and smells and stuff, and you never get this sort of specific background of what's happening. In the interview, Peter Carey did cite the Vietnam War, in fact, as one of the influences on this story. And also, he had been living in Europe in 1968, and there being this sort of mentality of hope and sort of positivity and youth culture and revolution, but also this sort of massive crackdown and policing and this sort of despair around the future. So I think that was very interesting historical context as well.
I mean, that historical context is really important, right? Because if dystopias are meant to level some sort of critique, then you take from the time period that you're making it in. Alex, as an expert in Australian genre film, I mean, Dead End Drive-In was made in the 80s, and the original story was in the 70s. Do you want to maybe just talk about Dead End Drive-In and how it maybe differs, or themes?
I would talk about. I'm really keen to talk about another kind of author, Mr. Brian Trenchard Smith, who made this film. A very different author. We're dealing with a genre film director, a proud genre film director, and a very good genre film director. His most famous film, I think, unarguably, would be BMX Bandits. Some of you guys look like the type of riffraff that might have spent many hours watching BMX Bandits. And Our Nicole. Dead End Drive-In, I think, is broadly understood as his best film. I think that's almost a given. And I think it's an extraordinary film. I agree with that. And I don't mean to diss other Brian Trenchard Smith films like Leprechaun 2 and Leprechaun 3. Night of the Demon 2 is a personal favourite. No irony there. It's a great film. What I love that Trenchard Smith brings to this really quite remarkable story that is still so... I mean, watching this film, I missed it when it played at MIFF, but I watched it again today. The opening title screens of this film are devastating to watch in 2017, and I'm sure that we'll get onto this later, but it's their Australia Day riots where 51 people die at the rocks, nuclear accidents at sea in the Pacific Ocean, race riots in South Africa that affect the economy and cause a Wall Street crash. I mean, they're very poignant. This is 1986, this is 2017. There's stuff going on there, as we say in film criticism, stuff's happening. But what I love about this film, one of my favourite little things that he does is when these people, Krabs and his cohorts, are trapped or imprisoned in this cinema, in this drive-in, the films that they're watching are Brian Trenchard Smith's old films. Yeah. One of them at the end is his Chok Soppy film, The Man from Hong Kong, which is amazing. He's very good at Australian kung fu films. I would highly recommend that one. But earlier on in the film, they're watching a film that he made called Turkey Shoot, which played at MIFF, I believe, a few years ago. Now, I don't want to ramble too much about this because I could fill the whole panel just talking about Turkey Shoot. It was famously shit-canned by Philip Adams as like one of the worst. Society is crumbling, the world is dying, it's all over because this ratbag called Brian Trenchard Smith made this film called Turkey Shoot. And it's very familiar, the kind of genre I think that it is. It's an exploitation genre, but it's very familiar to us today as the kind of human hunt game. And we know this through films like The Hunger Games, Running Man. But again, it has this very long history. So these go back at least to a short story by Richard Cornell from 1924 called The Most Dangerous Game, which is a cracker of a short story. But in film, we have Das Millienspiel, the German film from 1970. We have, of course, Battle Royale. We have Elio Petri's The 10th Victim that played at MIFF this year, which is a beautiful film, one of my favourite directors. And I really want to give a shout out to an incredible film, a really radical film called Punishment Park, by a guy called Peter Watkins from 1971, who is the father of docudramas. So this kind of, Hunger Games-y human hunt kind of thing that Turkey Shoot was about, the fact that he incorporates that into this, it's like a dystopian film placed inside another dystopian film, like a little Russian doll scenario.
It's clever. Really interesting.
It's authorship in a really different way.
Philip Adams canned it as well because that was the same Philip Adams that gave the original Peter Carey story to Stephen Murray Smith, the then editor of...
I suspect that might have something to do with it.
What did you think of the Ned Manning article where he said, Brian Trenchard Smith didn't read the story, and then apparently he said, according to this article that was published in the New Review a couple of days ago, 29th of July, apparently Manning said to Brian Trenchard Smith, "Oh, mate, that's a bit much showing your own film within the film."
I love the audacity of it. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I'm certainly wouldn't have any pretenses to come from a literary background. I'm a kind of, I'm a visual media kind of girl, but I think that, you know, self-referentiality, I think, is a cross-textual endeavour. You know, we see it in
And
art
it's so,
history.
it's so cheeky
we see it in
and
Brian
charming,
Trenchard Smith.
and I think it's something that Australian cinemas maybe lost a little bit of that cheek.
I think that Australian cinema could learn a lot from Brian Trenchard Smith. The joy of his films is where I would like to end. I think that for a really grim dystopian film in its premise that has really profound relevance, I think, as I said, to what's going on in this country and in the world today, there's just a joy. And maybe it's, you know, the machinations and the kids in the kitchens and the permed hairdos. There's something so zeitgeist
The aesthetic
that
world
is so
is so
joyful
good.
about this
Yeah.
world.
Well, the aesthetic of it is so much of the films of the time. You know, it's Starstruck, it's, you know, all those kind of really fizzy. I think of it like a Howard Arkley.
Fizzy is the perfect word.
Oh, thank you.
But the words, Claire. I like that.
Thanks. But, thank you. But I do. The look of it is so wonderful. And it has got totally that candy neon 80s look, which I think maybe goes back to, if we're talking about the difference, say, between film dystopia and written dystopia, is you can still get that pleasure of the look of it. And there's such I think there's a common critique across 80s Australian films around ideas of suburbia. It's definitely there in Dead End Drive-In, I think in the film, in perhaps it could be there submerged in the story, but I think it's stronger in the film, the sense of people having a suburban life. You know, there's blow-up pools and, you know, little palm trees and just that kind of thing that you see in films like Around the World in 80 Ways and stuff. It's really such an 80s moment.
One of my favourite little tidbits about this film, I have a friend who specialises in the history of Australian film distribution, and Dead End Drive-In did have a drive-in run at Australia. Can you imagine watching Dead End Drive-In at the drive-in with Turkey Shoot in that movie?
Imagine if your car broke down.
It's drive-ins all the way down.
And it was shot at Matraville Drive-In in Sydney, and I don't know if that drive-in is still going or whether it was shut
I'm
down.
not sure that that's still there.
There's a
There was
Blacktown.
one
Sorry.
still in Western Sydney when I was living
There
there.
is.
I'm
There's
not
a-
sure Matraville's still there.
There's a Blacktown Drive-In, which I haven't been to, which I'd love to go to, which apparently it's got like diner food and stuff like that. So it sounds like it'd be pretty fun. Does Melbourne have a drive-in?
If there's any
That's really
DVD,
encouraging.
one, isn't
any DVD, any drive-in distributors here, Dead End Drive-In, please.
The original Star Drive-In, where this story and film is set, was actually opposite Monash University, which was where Peter
course.
Carey went for 1 year and had a really spectacular failure doing 1 year of a science degree and then threw it in and went and got a job in advertising. So if you're sitting there having a horrible time at uni or at work and staring across the road, you never know, it might be like a career-making moment.
Write what you know, isn't that what they say?
Write what you know.
Yeah, I think fascinatingly with this stuff, Claire, you were talking about the origin of dystopia as a concept, which actually would have been from, I guess, thinkers wanting to conceptualize of a utopia.
That's
how
right.
things could work well.
That's right.
Whereas, I guess, in this context, assuming the best of intentions from the government of this world, they were just trying to corral. What was the word in the novel, in the story? Unmentionables? There was a word that was used, you know, and to kind of, I guess, keep society ticking over. And this seems to span a lot of dystopias. There's a kind of a government or a superstructure intending the best, you know, in their actions, which kind of maybe just goes too far. So this is kind of relevant to Other Life, which is Ben's film that I saw last night. And I'm sorry if I ask the same question. I did the Q&A as well. But you weren't there, were you? So it's fine. You can double up. But... yeah, and after seeing it now, I realized, and we talked about this, it's possibly not a full dystopia per se, but there are dystopic elements. So I hope this isn't a spoiler, but I think this is part of the synopsis, so I might just hint a bit. But there's a technology that's invented in Other Life, and the government wants to use it to keep criminals at bay, or for the justice system, we'll say. But it's possibly not the best thing to do. I think that's a nice non-spoilery description.
That's super vague, but
Yeah.
we'll go with it.
Isn't it? That's the point. I'm trying to be a good moderator by not giving away too much because you have to see it when it comes out. But yeah, but also during the emails you were talking about how you think, or you'd like to bring in a bit of optimism to this
Yeah.
panel. Do you want to just maybe
I just
expand
think
on
we
that idea?
villainize technology a lot, that's all. And I think the uninteresting science fiction is one that dwells on that. And in order to express a dystopic vision, you actually have to be quite thorough in constructing that world and sort of almost have to be optimistic about what its potential could be, and idealistic as well. You know, like for example, who saw Equilibrium? Everyone has to take this same drug that removes your emotions. Well, that would be a very difficult thing to enforce. So it's a very optimistic view to think that in order to create that world, you'd be able to do that. You know what I mean? So in order to construct your dystopia, I think you have to have a very sort of positive view of it first, and then you've got to tear it down for the sake of drama. But on Other Life, so when I first read the story and I was sort of trying to dissect how you present on film this technology that essentially allows you to edit your memories, I thought it was really silly, and I really had to find out find some grounding for it, basically. And I dug around a little bit, and I ended up getting in touch with a think tank from Oxford who had been employed by a collection of private prisons from around the world to basically invent a better prison. And they weren't being asked to create the technology, they were being asked to come up with the ideas for these prisons that they would then go on to figure out what technology needs to exist to make these things possible. And I'm talking about life extension, so you can serve 300 years, or hallucinogenic drugs that kind of keep you in a trance, or methods of stasis and virtual
Seriously?
prisons.
They're really doing that?
They're not really making them, they're really coming up with the ideas so that they can then kind of do a cost analysis of, just how much work would be required to make these things possible.
There's no
It's
dystopia
really-
you can imagine that the prison
No.
industrial complex is
No.
not already
So
imagined for.
I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it.
It's-
That's a bit shit.
Yeah.
So it's super punitive and has nothing to do with rehabilitation, but and everything to do with just misery essentially. But it was interesting to know that it's stranger than fiction. The thing I thought was silly is kind of been thought of by some very intelligent people whose job it is to kind of be cruel. I was enjoying the collaboration. They were really open. They were all massive nerds that were like, I love Blade Runner. And so we kind of had common ground to meet on, even though what they were doing was appalling. And then I got an email from the Oxford administration saying that this conversation is considered consultancy and that I would be billed for £120,000.
Whoa.
So I ended that right there. But anyway, where were we? The use of, I think the kind of crutch of vilifying technology is something that a lot of science fiction writing kind of falls on. But ultimately, what are we talking about? We're talking about the human experience of it, aren't we? That's what stories should be about. And so that became the focus, certainly for Other Life anyway.
And I guess there's this idea of familiarity with the world as well. Like I think some of the most effective dystopias are ones that mirror the world that we live in. You build a world that's believable, or I guess it more powerfully immerses the audience or takes them in really quickly, which then allows you to take them by surprise.
The thing I think is you don't have to invent dystopia. You
No.
just have to go
Yeah.
looking for it. Like
That's
dystopia
right.
already has a postcode on this planet.
Twitter
Yeah.
is a dystopia.
Manus Island is a dystopia.
Yeah.
I lived in Alice Springs when the intervention rolled in. I've seen army trucks going down the main street full of people going to invade a community near mine. And that kind of imagery, it's not imaginary. It's just not where
Yeah.
you live necessarily until it comes for you. And I think one of the pleasures of writing dystopian fiction is doing stuff to white people that white people do to other people.
Yeah, you've
It
just...
feels very vengeful to do it.
Yeah.
You don't have to look very far in history or geography to find dystopia.
Yeah.
And it can feel very vengeful and almost addictive to manipulate these tropes. And I think that's something that I think Cleverman also does really well, is turning these tropes around onto these hairy people and putting it another step outside of society.
I completely agree with that. And you've touched very sort of in a slightly different phrase. I can't remember who said this phrase, but I think it's absolutely true. I mean, dystopia is happening now. And as you said, Ben, like it's hard to think of anything that isn't already being thought of. I'll say one word here. Look it up when you leave here. Look up Palantir. Palantir is a high-tech surveillance company which is into precog. It's into finding out and stopping crime before it actually happens. And it's been used by the US Army in Iraq, and now it's been brought back home to the US. And of course, you can already see where we'd be going with that, because whose neighbourhoods are they going to be going into and targeting? And it was set up by Peter Thiel, who's one of the co-founders of PayPal. So every time you use PayPal, and he's an ally of Trump's, you're putting money in his pocket. But the point about that is that we often think of these big West Coast tech companies as kind of libertarian and, you know, maybe even slightly left-wing, and that's not necessarily the case at all. But look up Palantir, it's extraordinary. But you touched on a line which is one of my favourite lines about dystopia, which is that dystopia is when what is already happening to brown people starts happening to white people.
Yeah, taking something from the world that exists now, and then taking that a step further is kind of something that dystopias do. Do you think that dystopias have a role as a kind of a warning, or do dystopian artists who create dystopias, are they kind of prophesying in a way? I mean, you, Claire, your novel is described as a dystopia. I don't know if you own that description, but do you find yourself as someone, you know, warning people about something, some impending doom?
I think my first novel was more like that. It's not a dystopia. It's looking at issues that might be raised by increased genetic engineering, and that's only gone a lot faster since I wrote the book. We've got CRISPR gene editing of embryos that is happening now, this year. Last year we had the first embryo ever in history with 3 biological parents and not 2, and that was editing out some problems with mitochondrial DNA. And that was the kind of stuff that I was looking at in my book, and I was very interested in class. With my current novel, it's more based on ideas around occupation and warfare, and I'm very interested, you know, a bit like you were saying about prisons, I'm very interested in how all these technological developments go to warfare first. So, for example, we are all cyborgs already, and just think about that in terms of you're a cybernetically networked organism already with your mobile phone. Imagine how you feel if you leave it somewhere. But a lot of that identity that you have is owned by private companies, so Google can block your access to the cloud, and it does do that with people that it gets upset with, like people who resell phones in a way it doesn't like. So dystopias often deal with, if you think about the classic dystopias like 1984, it's often about forced inclusion. You know, you're made to be part of this society and do things that you don't like. But a lot of our actual selves, which now exist in the cloud and on social media and even in like cloud documents that you may or may not be able to get access to, are actually owned by private companies, and they don't have to provide you with those services. They can exclude you anytime they like. So that's a very different kind of dystopia. But yeah, I was struggling with my novel to keep saying, look, all this is happening now. It's not really a warning. But the point is that we don't understand the present. Dystopia is about trying to understand the present. That's what I think. It's about tools to understand the present, because we can only ever write about and think about the present. We can't, you know, it just is really good to try and understand what's happening now, because most people don't. It's really difficult to understand what's happening now.
I think another function of dystopia, actually, as well as being this sort of, well, how bad can things get kind of intellectual exercise, I think that dystopias can also function as a tool of let's call it revolutionary thought. You look at The Handmaid's Tale, which is having a wonderful renaissance. You look at Charlotte Wood's novel, The Natural Way of Things. There's a fine tradition of feminist dystopias as well, and of dystopia as a story of resistance, because you set up this world of how terrible things can get, and then where's your narrative? Your narrative is people fighting back against that and people breaking out. I think that's one of the reasons why dystopias are also a really common young adult genre, or sometimes get relegated to young adulthood, because they can be stories of kind of hope and breaking out and breaking free, and sort of asking that question of at what point do you crack, and how do you organise? And I think those are really important questions for our time too.
I do think you need to have a kind of childlike naivety to invent it in the first place. You know, like you can over-intellectualize this, but essentially in order to create a vision for the future, you sort of have to oversimplify what is a very complicated our worldview, right now, the world is very complicated. And media is really good at simplifying it for us. And information control is very well versed at creating heroes, villains, and just kind of breaking it down for us so it's easy to consume and easy to understand. If you actually step back and try and get a broader view, it's really intricate. I mean, it's very difficult for most people to have a complete picture and therefore a balanced view.
And that makes
But
us
to create
manipulable as well.
Oh,
Because
totally.
then we're sort of manipulated by this narrative now in politics of pragmatism, and the adults are making pragmatic decisions like giving all our money to coal mines. And they're not
But
actually
then-
very
Yes, if
practical
only they were
decisions.
pragmatic.
Yeah,
But then
exactly.
there's the kind of naive assumption that like one little idea would suddenly make everyone controllable
Yeah,
in
totally.
this dystopic view. You know, like Running Man, where one TV show is enough to keep people under control. You know, like, that's it. All it took was one TV show.
I think horror is a really important sort of side, almost like a cousin of dystopia. I wouldn't say that all horror films are dystopian. I think that would be just incorrect. But I think that there is a very strong tradition in horror cinema where it critiques our susceptibility to screen media in particular, very self-reflexive. And we see that in films like Poltergeist. We see it in things like Lamberto Bava's Demons. We see it in... what's the other one? Oh, Videodrome, of course, David Cronenberg's Videodrome. Most recently and most powerfully, I think, one of my favourite films this year, we see it in Get Out. I hope Christos Tsiolkas isn't here. He'll kick my ass for saying that he wasn't a fan. But it's an extraordinary film where the television literally becomes a tool to imprison black people by white people so that they can take their bodies. It's just, I mean, a remarkable film. An area of particular interest to me has always been found footage horror films, because to me they're technological, or they're films about techno-hubris, about how technology will fail us. You know, we can own the technology, we can physically have it be part of our body. I like this idea that we're cyborg, and I think the more that I think about found footage horror, the less that I think of it as a viewing device, and the more that I think of it as a mask. It's an object that we press up to our faces, and that's the premise of found footage horror, that it becomes part of our body. But I've seen hundreds and hundreds of these films for the book that I wrote on these movies, and I would say almost all of them, they fail. Technology fails us. It doesn't protect us. It doesn't reveal any truth. And I think that horror has a particular strength through its unique kind of visceral metaphor. And the supernatural, the idea of the supernatural being closely linked to media anxieties goes back to spiritualism and the Telegraph. And there's a wonderful book by Jeffrey Sconce called Haunted Media that tracks that history, through networked radio and the relationship to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, that our anxieties about media come through in these sort of supernatural stories. And I think that horror is in a really unique position. I'm going slightly off tangent here.
No, I agree with you. And
agree
it
too.
doesn't have to be a question of technology either. I think you can make a case that Wake and Fright is a dystopian film.
Yes, definitely.
Oh,
And
100%.
Yeah.
And Razorback.
And it's low
Yeah,
tech. I mean, I recently rewatched Puberty Blues, and I think you can make a case that is also a dystopian film.
I completely agree, because dystopia isn't necessarily about technology at all.
No.
It's about social arrangements.
It's about political organisation.
I always think of Wake and Fright as an Australian dystopia, very much so.
Yeah.
I think the big crossover for horror would probably be body horror.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where the science fiction element often crosses. I mean, I think the prime example of that, the granddaddy of them all, would have to be RoboCop, which has quietly become one of the most prophetic films ever made. Everyone remembers I'd buy that for $1, right? And I remember when I was a kid thinking, what a dumb TV show, why does everyone like this show? And by today's standard, that almost seems highbrow, so
There was
it kind of totally came true.
there was a wonderful,
At least by
Yeah.
today's standards, those cops seem quite friendly.
That's right, yeah. Well, don't forget,
there was a
like,
wonderful review about
just-
RoboCop. Sorry.
Oh, just to use another bad film as a good example, Idiocracy,
I was thinking of that before. Yeah.
Definitely.
where you just kind of go, this is terrible, but oh shit, it's kind of come true.
But it's
isn't it,
actually
you
worse
know?
now.
It's actually worse.
It's a
worse than
documentary.
this. Yeah, that's right.
It's what plants
And I think
crave.
the TV show they were all watching in that was, who remembers, was it something about getting kicked in the balls constantly?
Ow my balls.
Ow my balls.
I was going to get
Yeah,
mixed
that's
up with
it.
the Lego movie, which
Yeah.
maybe is a dystopia too, but which is Where's my pants? I think this is
Yeah.
definitely a tangent.
But I think we all agree that we live in dystopia. Okay,
Yeah,
those,
sure.
those doors will be closing now. Please line up at the rear. We'll be taking your wallets.
I think the body horror angle is a really, really interesting one, and I'm so glad you mentioned Orson Welles, because I was actually lecturing on War of the Worlds yesterday, and it's exactly that thing that you've got the idea that there was supposedly a mass panic after the broadcast, which isn't true, but it's a screen memory of that tussle between media, because it was pushed by the newspapers, because they were very worried about this new medium of radio, and CBS, the radio station, was quite happy about the story because it emphasised their power and reach to advertisers. But you're quite right, it becomes this cautionary tale of fears around being haunted by the media, which I think ties in nicely with Dead End Drive-In, because we've got our big screen. And without being the spoiler for the story, there's a technological metamorphosis in that, which I think comes back to ideas of being the cyborg. And I was asked recently to try and say something positive about new technology, and I said, well, I'm looking forward to being more of a cyborg. We're all cyborgs already, as I said, but I look forward to the idea of being more of a cyborg and having less vulnerability, and more, I don't want to be Robocop, but I would like to be able to fly, or maybe not get Alzheimer's or whatever, and I'm sure all of us harbour a few things like that, right? Maybe we don't have to wear glasses anymore, or whatever it is. So that was one of my modest hopes for technology, was to actually become more of a cyborg.
Well, there's potential utopian elements
Definitely.
of a post-human future,
Yeah.
It might be lovely. Yeah, very much.
Maybe.
But all the cyberpunk stuff that I grew up on has already come true. It came true a long time ago.
Yeah.
Even just body modification for sex of vanity, like the stuff that used to horrify me, we see all the time, people growing horns and like kind of going for that grotesque cosmetic surgery that,
Do you remember
has a niche,
the
but
networked dildo? Remember that story? Okay, one of my...
Oh yeah, we have those.
Yeah, so one of my students brought this up when we were talking about exactly that issue, and around the idea of, say you get, like in films like Her or Ex Machina, where you get, this kind of ideal female, comes up a lot in these kind of films, who's endlessly compliant, endlessly interested, endlessly listening, etc. And one of my students said, wow, you know about the network dildo, don't you? And I said, oh, I think I might have heard about it. And apparently it was a wee vibe, and there was a scandal just a few months ago where it was found that, unbeknown to the couples, because it's meant to be a kind of couples vibrator, who used it, is that it was sending back all this information to the manufacturer about body temperature, how long you were doing it for, and you think, what are they doing with that information?
metadata so they can sell more dildos.
I guess.
I mean, basically, that's all it comes down to. Is
Well, you
selling
would
more
think
details.
so,
I don't know
but-
if there's a nefarious... I mean, there could be a nefarious purpose. I'm struggling to think of what that might be.
But the fact is, they didn't know about it, though.
Yeah, that is creepy.
That's creepy.
But if we know about it, it makes it okay? Because how many times do you get a new phone and it says, can we please rob you of all your details?
Well, the problem is
and
they
we'll
keep...
give you all these features if you do it. And you're like,
Yeah.
sure, now that I know about it, I feel okay with
True.
it. I'm in
Yeah.
control here.
And they keep changing
All
the
read
conditions.
terms of service, right?
That's right.
Whoever reads that stuff.
Well, one of my issues with sex robots, which is another panel I've been discussing on, is if a dildo can be, sending back a lot of information to a manufacturer, just imagine how much a sex robot would. Maybe I am slightly getting off the topic here.
It's okay, I'm keeping tabs. Making notes about everything, and we'll use this against
I
you.
wish I was looking over here to see what the sign for sex robot was.
Oh yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Round of applause.
This is a very important
If you learn
piece of sign
nothing from
language.
tonight, that's the most important.
You weren't expecting that, were you?
Can I just segue back into Dead End Drive-In for a minute, and ask you guys what you think is with Cars, an Australian dystopia?
I was thinking a lot of the Cars that ate Paris when I was revisiting this.
Which came out 2 years,
2 years after
the
Crabs. Yeah,
Crabs was
yeah, it's an
published.
interesting line. And then, of course, we have a young gentleman by the name of Max, who I believe is quite mad, who appeared a few years later.
Heard of this
Yeah,
guy?
yeah, he's pretty good apparently, I've heard. In fact, Claire, I think you have something to tell us about Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. Is that true?
I could do if...
Can I?
Yes,
I'm
go
so
on.
excited about
Go
it.
on. Gossip is always welcome.
Well, I was an extra on the Thunderdome sequences of Mad Max 3. I'd been overseas. I'd actually been in Los Angeles because my father was a director. And I came back and it was 1984 and I knew people in the film industry and I got myself to be one of the extras. And it was a very... It was extraordinary because the set for Bartertown was in the old Homebush brick pits, which are no more in Sydney. It's now Olympic Park. And those brick pits go back to colonial times and they had been very contaminated and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the brick pits had been shut down. It was huge, basically a giant quarry. And they'd built the entire town of Bartertown in this quarry. So in terms of speaking about dystopias and dystopian environments, it was a world unto itself. And you arrived... And I'd done a fair bit of extra work by that time, so I knew what it was like, but this was different to any other set that I'd ever worked on. Do you want me to continue?
I don't know about these guys. I'm totally want to hear more.
Oh, cool. Okay. So they had very deliberately cast sort of very unusual-looking people, and I was, a teenage white girl who wasn't that unusual looking, so it was only because I knew the assistant directors that they kept asking. So I was like a kind of feral kid. And everybody else was like fatogram strippers and Asian bodybuilders, and Jiling Ning, who was the eponymous China girl in the David Bowie film clip. She was one of the Imperial Guards.
Wow.
Yeah, very striking. And they all had mohawks and S&M type looking gear. There was Angry Anderson, of course, and what happened was we would arrive at about 6 o'clock at night at the brick pits and they would spray us with brick dust, which was just horrible on the skin, and it caused endless clashes between the crew and the extras. And we had our rags, each of us had our own set of rags that we would get into. And it felt very freeing because you were filthy, so you could roll around on the ground. And then we would spend all night hanging off the Thunderdome. All night. And they'd made the Thunderdome really well, so you could kind of lean on it and half go to sleep. I've even found myself in the sequence, I think. But because some of the people were not very well physically, some of the fatogram strippers and things didn't really like to spend 8 hours hanging off the Thunderdome. So the assistant directors spent an awful lot of time rounding people up because you had this whole set, like people were cooking hot bread on the set. It was a world. It was a proper sort of working town. And I remember Roger Ebert saying in his review that the Thunderdome set and the Bartertown set is one of the most remarkable in the history of filmmaking, and he put it right up there with the Casablanca. And yeah, it felt like living another life. We all had other jobs and we would work from 6 at night till 6 in the morning. And I remember George Miller, they would just, as the sun was coming up, they would just be praying for us to climb the Thunderdome one more time for one last take. Please, please, just one more.
I like thinking of a parallel universe where that town is still going on and they're having little panels about whether or not we exist.
Yeah, probably.
Tina Turner's massive earrings still controlling things.
That's right.
The way it should be.
I suspect people are having relationships behind the hay bales and who knows.
They're down several generations by now.
Probably, yeah, definitely. So it qualifies, I think, in that it was definitely a world, a complete world unto itself. It certainly felt that way, and I think that shows on the film.
I'm going to do a really, really seamless segue here. This is actually based off a question from the audience that was emailed beforehand, which is not a typical thing that happens, but they attribute themselves as Francis and Spaghetti. If you were here, hello, Francis and Spaghetti. I'm not sure if you're a person or a collective, but thank you for the question.
That would be appropriate, a collective.
I think so. I mean, various noodles. Apparently they're not noodles. I don't know, I'm foreign, and I say, I'm foreign, and I say they're noodles, but anyway. That is the biggest tangent of this night.
So we're talking... start on Marco Polo, let's start on Marco Polo.
Yes. So you're talking about the deliberate construction of a world in the Madman kind of universe, but Ben, last night we were talking about you kind of responding to the limitations of budget and circumstance when you were creating Other Life. So you worked with that and you chose to set your story with its dystopic elements in the now. And there are all these resonances with current technology and where it's going and possibly even developing its own intelligence. It's really hard to talk about this without spoiling your film. But the question from Francis and Spaghetti is, there seems to be a disproportionate representation of dystopian futures in speculative and sci-fi film. does this imbalance in the cultural imagination of the future become a self-fulfilling prophecy of catastrophe? Do you think, what are your thoughts on that, as someone who did kind of take from the existing world of Perth, it's set in Perth?
So let me just retreat to the filmmaking for a second, because I can talk about that. So Mad Max is a good example, and you brought up this kind of attachment we have to cars. Obviously, when you make sequels to films that are successful, you perpetuate the world and you build on it, and you probably push the look and feel of it even harder than the original, because that's what you have to do. You have to top the gag, right? But let's be honest, when George first set out to make Mad Max, there wasn't a dystopian vision for the future behind it. There was a necessity driven by being able to afford these shitty cars and going, well, why do all our characters have shitty cars? I know, let's make it the near future where no one can afford anything. You know, like you just kind of construct your world out of what you have at your disposal. That's filmmaking. And then on the back of that, you rationalize how and why and what it means. And look, there are lots of bad examples of this too, and we don't talk about those because they're not very interesting. But the ones that are interesting, that really resonate, are the ones that have that sort of beating heart, you know, that sort of consistency, that thematic consistency at least. So, you know, just to bring it back to my own film, certainly that was necessity drives, you know, and the source material that the film I made was based on was an extremely high concept novel set in a future so far from now that it bordered on fantasy again. It was almost psychedelic in its sort of in its concepts, and the kind of spiritual journey that the main character goes on was whack. Let's just say that. How do you make an independent science fiction film in Perth that addresses that scale? You know, I mean, famously, James Cameron didn't make Avatar for 15 years because technology simply wasn't available to make it possible. So, yeah, we had to kind of come up for a vision of our world that made sense for our setting, that what we could afford. And we did, you know, like we kind of went, as I said last night, and sorry for anyone who's hearing this twice, we went for the max headroom model 20 years into the future, and the idea that after the mining boom in WA had popped, that bubble is gone, that's miraculously all that resource is being reinvested into innovation. And so now Perth is a sort of new Silicon Valley where tech innovation is happening. I know, right? Wouldn't it be awesome?
It would be awesome.
It's not, but it should. And so that was our rationale for why this city, why this time, why does it look that way, you know? Why aren't there flying cars? So.
But then there's also these lovely reference points in the film to startup culture and the gender politics of startup culture and like the relationships that happen there. And I think that like you used it to your advantage for sure.
Well, that's
like,
what
it's not just a limitation, it's obviously play.
Exactly. You got to turn a weakness into a strength. And that's why I sort of started with Mad Max, because I think that's a great example of we've got a beat up car and a camera. Let's make something cool.
And so writers who have no such physical limitations,
Right.
why do we reiterate the same stories?
I think because
Wow.
you're probably visually inspired by film, maybe on some level.
Well,
No.
that's interesting. Partly, I think that's
No.
true.
No? Okay.
No,
That's a
it
really-
comes from the unconscious.
Well, I
Okay.
know Claire has a theory on this, but before you go into that, I just
Sure.
wanted to reference Brian E. Doyle's book, The Island Will Sink,
Oh,
which
it's
is
so good.
very, very cinematic novel. Probably more post-apocalyptic genre and very much the catastrophe film rather than a dystopia, but it also has some really interesting technological elements in it. Highly recommend it to you.
I recommend it also.
Yeah.
I loved an academic paper that I came across, which was called The Car, Mad Max and Australian Governance, and it actually went into aspects of Australian governance, including things like stolen generation, with children being taken away in cars, and then referencing Mad Max, which I thought was really interesting. And one of the quotes from it that I thought was so beautiful was it called Australia, let me get this right because it was such a beautiful phrase, the petrochemical cyborg chrome-plated Republic of Oz. Isn't that wonderful?
Yes.
Oh, and I don't at all mean that novels aren't visual. I think mine are very visual. I just mean that some of them could be inspired by film, but I think the wellsprings are deep from the unconscious, as they are with film too.
True.
Yeah.
And jumping off from that idea of inspiring and, I guess, cinema, as a medium for envisioning, do you think possibly there's any potential for a dystopian representation to catalyze an actual negative event? Is that I'm bleeding between art and real life, I guess, is what my
If I was to give
Francis.
an uninformed answer to that, I would say possibly, but surely the opposite is more true, that we would be inspired to do better. If anything, I would have thought that would be much more often the case.
And I think there's possibly also a broader question, maybe it's historiographic or about canon. When we talk about these films, we talk about films that we all know. My wonderful colleague at RMIT, Ramon Lombardo, came up with the most extraordinary phrase, which is the slaughterhouse of cinema, which he uses to talk about the hundreds and thousands of movies that are just like straight to video that we've all missed. While you guys were talking, I was thinking, I don't even know why it came to me, about this movie that I used to hire religiously when I was a kid because it was always boom in shot, called Space Mutiny, and it was literally just a girl in a bikini driving around in a golf buggy that was covered in silver foil. I was obsessed with this film. Nothing happens. I was so obsessed with it because I loved the audacity of it. I think at the time I thought it was one of those so bad it's good, but in retrospect I just loved that was a film for somebody. Like, this is our film, is a golf buggy, a girl in a bikini and tinfoil. Space Mutiny, I'm going to hire it for a year religiously. Like,
Isn't that in the background of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert?
But I think that when we start talking about, these kind of broader discourses or patterns or trends that start emerging in cinema, and I'm sure that the same thing happens in fact, I think the slaughterhouse of cinema is a phrase riffing on the idea of the slaughterhouse of literature. This idea that we're not talking about all film because we don't know about all film. Perhaps that's a little of a bigger question about canonisation and what we do know and what we don't know. But certainly in the case of Australian cinema, I think, as we've just seen with the Pioneering Women program, there are a lot of films that we remember, and there are a lot that have just completely vanished.
And Alex, this is a good point for you to plug your project of Australian women's cinema.
I've been plugging
online.
that non-stop. I have a website on Australian women's filmmaking from 1980 to 1999, and I was surprised that there were so many. Claire, probably you weren't, because you were sort of writing on film during that period beautifully. But I knew that there was a lot of women making films during that period, but I had no idea how many feature films were made. And this is my job. Like, I'm meant to know this stuff. I was really struck. But I think that it applies to cinema, certainly in Australia more generally. This is really going off tangent, but we have some great dystopian trash cinema that's been completely, Outback Vampires. Who's seen Outback Vampires? Represent. Proud man up the back. Good.
Do you remember Thirst?
Sorry?
Thirst?
Oh, I love Thirst.
How good is Thirst?
It's one of my favourite
I feel like I
Australian
need to
films.
sit you all down and make you write me a list before I leave Melbourne.
But that was,
But it's so hard to find this stuff now.
Thirst is on DVD. Acme Mediatek. I know that you're not from town, but I really recommend the Acme Mediatek if you're.
I have a DVD player. So last century.
Hey, I have VHS.
Wow.
But yeah, the Acme Mediatek. If you feel like going on a treasure hunt and discovering what you found, they have amazing genre film, Australian genre film, low budget, the stuff that we're kind of talking about.
I think it's really interesting, back to that point about the crossover between literature and film. In that interview that I did with Peter Carey, he talks about how the story Crabs actually started in his head as a film script. And so it was something that he'd sort of half written and then put away and then gone back to and turned it into a short story because he was starting to get excited about short fiction and something that he could write quickly in between his advertising job. And so I think that the fact that it actually comes from the slaughterhouse of cinema and then is returned to cinema.
Was he working in advertising at the time?
While he was writing Crabs.
Yeah. Because I'm just wondering if that then has an impact on the sort of visual imagination of his work.
I think there's definitely an essay and possibly a thesis in that, because his early short stories have this wonderful ability to manipulate imagery and throw disparate images together in this quite punchy way. And I feel like it's a skill that translates well to advertising. And I'm not sure if it's something that comes from advertising or it's something that he was naturally good at and honed in these two different jobs that he did.
There's a really interesting parallel there with Brian Trenchard Smith, who worked in advertising also, and he really cut his teeth professionally as a trailer editor of great repute in the UK and Australia during the 60s and 70s. He did a lot of Hammer horror. I think he did some Nick Rogue films. So.
And another great sort of sci-fi director who started in advertising, of course, is Ridley Scott. I mean, I'm sure there's many others.
Yeah, Romero started making industrial films, or he certainly was doing industrial films. So yeah,
Someone pitched this panel. Films who came filmmakers from advertising.
Yeah. Does advertising
2018.
cause the dystopian impulse?
It does.
hell yeah, I'll call it.
Well, I guess you're always thinking about impact, aren't you? If you're making advertising, you often have, of course, a bigger budget per minute than any feature film director, and you're specifically trying to manipulate people and have very particular kinds of impact. So I guess it's not surprising that you'd be thinking about those issues.
This comes, interestingly, links into a question, Adolfo, that you mentioned for me just in our earlier discussions about whether dystopian films are by default necessarily exploitation films. And I come very, very much from the Abel Ferrara, my Lord and Master, the school that all cinema is exploitation, all films are exploitation films, war films are exploitation films, Dunkirk is an exploitation film.
Cool.
But I think it's a really, you know, when we talk about things like Fritz Lang's Metropolis or Chris Marker's La Jetée or Jane Arden's Anti-Clock, which I would strongly recommend if you have an interest in dystopian cinema. What else? Oh, Lizzie Borden's Born in Flames that played at MIFF last year, just an extraordinary film. These are all, you know, really, I mean, they paint a very broad terrain for dystopian cinema. But then we have, you know, our cherry 2000s and our sort of, you know, our more sort of B grade, what we would typically describe as exploitation cinema. And I think what we have here is a highbrow, lowbrow, and I think that dystopian cinema really straddles that because I think, and Claire, this comes back to what you were saying, it's something within, like it's in our DNA, these sort of fantasies, be they dark or light.
It's kind of interesting in that context that you've got this sort of, you know, Carey's story, which is sort of capital L literary, then ends up being made by Brian Trenchard Smith and is talked about I've seen lots of reviews online of Dead End Drive-In talking about it as Ozploitation, you know, which is kind of an interesting mixture, and there's quite a few other examples like that, where you've got this kind of maybe supposedly highbrow source and then this kind of very visceral, if you like, exploitation.
And I think that also raises another issue about genre in general and the class differential with genre writing seen as not very highbrow or not very literary, whereas I read a lot of science fiction as well as a lot of literary fiction, and I think science fiction is more often the place where the ideas are.
Well, I do too.
I think
Very much so.
And hopefully you would all agree. But there's this sort of false distinction, I think, which is that this bourgeois literary genre exists where all the thinking happens, and for some reason all the thinking is about middle-aged men's marital problems. It's fucking boring. I'd much rather read Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed for the 57th time. Let's face it.
We get that in cinema a lot. I think the most famous example is Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, which won an Oscar in 1960, I think, for Best Foreign Film, which was inspired by a whole an enduring Swedish folktale tour on his daughter, I think it was called, and then famously turned into one of the most famous exploitation films of all time, Last House on the Left, by Wes Craven, one of the great American films of the late 20th century. So we have this very, very highbrow Bergman film, this very, very lowbrow Craven film, but the politics on a really fundamental level in the Craven film is absolutely radical. It's an absolutely subversive film. It devastates me now more than it did the first time I saw it. Bergman, he's our man. I'm not going to diss Bergman at the Melbourne International Film Festival. he's my man. He's my buddy. I'm pro Bergman. But it's a very conservative film. It's a very, very conservative film, the way that film ends. And I don't want spoilers for a film made in 1960, but it's a very strong Christian message. And I think this highbrow, lowbrow, this idea that ideas might be more developed in the highbrow material, that's why I love my dirty, crappy films, because they really prove that wrong a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I love the fact I've literally just finished reading Danse Macabre, which is Stephen King talking about horror novels and films between 1950 and 1980. And he's got a list of his sort of favourite horror films at the back, and I love the fact that he includes Bergman as a horror filmmaker, and he also includes Picnic at Hanging Rock as one of his favourite horror films of all time, which I think is fantastic, because it is, and it's that wonderful kind of submerged quality that it's got, and I love the fact that King just refuses to recognise, that those distinctions. And just to throw back to something we were talking about earlier about apocalypse and the joy in that, he talks a bit in that book about writing The Stand, which I think did they make that into a mini-series or something?
Yeah, Rob Lowe was in it.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen it. But King is absolutely upfront that his great pleasure in writing The Stand was in wiping everything out.
Yeah. There's something so cathartic about the apocalypse genre, I think.
I think a big part of this conversation should be the fact that in order for us to relate to media of any kind, you have to kind of place yourself in it, don't you? And the so-called highbrow arts are perhaps slightly more difficult to position yourself in or to relate to on that level, or to, but a very simple genre conceit. Hey, imagine if you found a suitcase of money. That's something we'd all go, what would I do? And then in a dystopia, it's even more a case of, I'd be the hero. And not to conflate post-apocalyptic with dystopia, but in our fantasies of the future, no one's the zombie. You're the guy with the shotgun.
Except in that fantastic zombie love story movie, what's that called?
Oh, don't say Warm Bodies.
Warm Bodies. The rom-com.
But even then, he was a special zombie, different to the others, you see? But that's what I'm saying, in a dystopia, there is this idea that you have a more distinct force to fight against, a simplified vision that you can stand apart from.
But I think also, counter to that, I think the horror genre is very naturally queer in the sense that there is a lot of identification with monsters going on, and vampires and werewolves and all of that shit. And so, you're not necessarily identifying as the hero in all genre film or all genre stories, but I agree, in the dystopia, it tends to be the rebel, the one person.
Well, I mean, one of the failings of cinema can be when you relate to the villain more than, and it pretty much happens in every Bond film, where you're I kind of wish the bad guy got away with it, because at least he had a plan.
Yeah.
And I want to see the results of that plan paying off. And the same can be said for...
And we're slowly seeing Batman get worse.
Well, I was going to say...
More villainous, because he becomes more attractive the more villainous he gets.
And anti-heroes have been all the rage for a couple of decades now, and I think it's because we've sort of figured out that there's a sort of... I don't know, it's almost a fetish, isn't it?
There's a great book by a feminist film theorist called Carol J. Clover called Men, Women and Chainsaws. And in that book, she just has the most extraordinary phrase where she champions slasher films in particular by saying that they give us the rare pleasure of being able to be Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf. And I love that. And I think that applies to films outside of slasher. But I think it's a lovely view, that kind of acknowledging our own perversion, but allowing us a kind of flexible allegiance, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe porn as well, able to take whichever side you want and play around with that. And maybe dystopias allow us to have that with our political imagination. Able to imagine ourselves as the perpetrator as well, and then look at our own complicity in systems that we're...
And no matter how grim or dark or awful the concept might be, we still kind of secretly think, like you said before, I don't have to go to work tomorrow.
I think very much so.
in a desert world where you get to drive fast.
Very much so, and don't have to do my taxes.
And I have one thing to worry about, and that's having enough fuel. That's it.
And whether I can get banana fritters at the Easy Eat.
Well, at least it's one of the things I love about Crabs, though, is that it actually deals with this really important issue of food. Because one of the things that I just don't buy in most post-apocalypses is the food. So much as I love Mad Max films, I don't believe that those people are getting enough to eat in those bleak wastes. They just aren't.
I ask those questions all the time.
I do
It's
too.
very annoying, yeah.
And I, I ask those of my writing students. I was supervising this master's student and she was writing a YA dystopia and everybody was living underground and there was a sandstorm circling the world. And I said, and she's just like written onto the third book of this trilogy. And I said, so how are people getting enough to eat? And she sort of went, oh, they got farms. I said, what, underground? And she's like, yeah. And I said, so what, you've got mirrors, you know, getting sunlight down underground? And she's kind of like,
Mushrooms.
oh, yeah. And I said, you've got a sandstorm, so that's like a nuclear winter. There's not enough. And she was like, oh, I'm really glad you said that. I hadn't thought of that. And I'm just like, well, whenever I think of these post-apocalypses, I think, you know, people need a lot of food to survive. We're very expensive animals to keep fed, and I'm not buying it.
But that's part of that sort of naivety I was mentioning
Yes.
before, that in order to create these visions of the future, you do have to have a little bit of license and
Yes.
imagine that, you know, maybe they have some sort of protein snack. I don't know.
I was
And
always...
it comes back to the play of them as well, like creatively, how fun it is to do this world
Yeah.
building and sort of make this little box and go, oh, and this and this
Yeah.
and this. And you do have to think through strategically, like, how do things work? And you can sort of fudge some of it and make some of it a bit fuzzy and vague, but you actually, even in a short story that's only this long, you have to know exactly what they're getting to eat and you have to be
Yeah.
able to predict what the questions are that the reader's going to be asking.
Anyone see Snowpiercer? Because
Yes.
Oh, so
Yes.
good.
In my opinion, that's a
protein
compilation
bars.
of every idea
Yeah.
ever. It's like,
Yeah.
let's have a bit of Soylent Green and
Yeah.
a bit of 1984.
Definitely.
And like, it was just
Yeah.
like, it was,
Yeah.
and let's all cram it on a train.
Yep.
It was, yeah.
There's a lot that I love about Snowpiercer, and
Except the ending.
yeah, but it's got that thing of being part of the machine, which I mentioned with Modern Times and also with The Matrix, and I love that aspect of it. And of course, you were saying earlier about that utopias and dystopias are often very bounded. You know, they're often a simple environment, so that we can take, it's that Aristotelian unity of time and place. So you get the train, or the shopping mall in Logan's Run, or I know it's
drive-in.
sorry.
Or the drive-in.
The drive-in, absolutely, and it becomes. And there's a really interesting critical discourse around the Thomas More Utopia, which started it all, which is that there's a. If you look at the cover of Utopia, I think it's a drawing he might have done himself, and he describes it, and it's an island that was a peninsula, and the king has cut it off in a kind of reverse birth. He's cut the cord, and Utopia's talked about in a really interesting way as almost a return to childhood, because utopias are always bounded. They tend to be underground or on an island is the most common location. And it's this sense of being able to explore a bounded space, a bit like a child, but almost with a kind of masculine, I'm talking in psychoanalytic terms, I don't mean that such people are male or female, but simply what's talked about psychoanalytically as a kind of masculine consciousness, but with this feminine embracement. It's just really interesting. It's done a lot with utopias.
Interestingly, and going back to your, not just Snowpiercer, but also your reference to food, this is reminding me a lot of Okja. Have you guys seen Okja?
Yeah.
Not yet.
Which I think is a dystopian film about precisely that, the childhood imagination, the need for food, and such interesting gender politics. And again, I don't mean just male-female, but the masculine-feminine dynamic in that film, I think, is
So
really
just
extraordinary.
to keep beating the childlike wonder naivety drum a little bit harder, my favourite moment in the Sydney Film Festival was when the director of Okja was brought up for the Q&A, and a very articulate and appropriate question was asked, which is, all your films have quite a heavy political messaging behind them. What comes first? You know, what idea drives it? In Snowpiercer, was it the politics? Was it the environment with Okja? Was it our food consumption or our obsession with consumption? What was it? And the director's answer was that he imagined the face of a sad pig, and he wanted to know what happened to that sad pig.
That's so brutal.
And I just love the fact that that is what comes first. And I think in all cases it should. I don't know, and I've said this for most of the time that I've been in film, that you sort of can't make films about themes. If you do, they will inherently be dry and uninteresting and not necessarily compelling narratively.
And I think
you set out to tell a story about a thing, and then the themes fall in place around it as you discover it through the process of making it.
I think for me at least, the image is primary in fiction as well. Like
Yeah.
you begin with the image and the image leads you to the meaning, not the other way around.
Yeah, totally.
And if you try and stuff the meaning into the image, it won't go.
That's reverse engineering the
Yeah.
idea in a very clumsy
I
way.
very much agree with that with writing fiction, and that's why I mentioned the role of the unconscious, because that's where that image is coming from. So yeah, absolutely. And I one of the things that I've seen with a lot of this early criticism of Carey is that there were some critics who charged him with having kind of morals and that he was writing fables, and I don't agree with that at all. I think he's very much led by the image too.
I'm really sorry to be cutting this off. It's all so riveting. We've actually only got about 7 minutes, so we could probably slip in one audience question, unless you're happy for them to just keep chatting away, which I am also. So we've got one.
There's a great film called The Tribe that you might have seen.
Yeah.
That leaps to mind immediately. I think it's one of the best films I've seen in the last 5 years, just flat out. It's set in a deaf school, and it's about the violence that explodes amongst that community, and it's difficult to tell what is fantasy and what is real.
It's amazing.
The most powerful thing about this film is that it doesn't include subtitles. It excludes hearing audience members, and it's... I don't know whether it's technically a dystopian film, but I certainly would say in terms of the impact that it had on me, I don't know if that's a useful answer.
There's a film called Blindness with Mark Ruffalo and Julianne Moore, which is a pretty fresh take on the post-apocalyptic idea where
It's not based on the Saramago, is it?
everyone loses their sight and there's one person left who can see.
There's a novel by Jose Saramago that is pretty much the same
Yeah.
kind of dystopia.
I think it's an adaptation of that. I think
Yeah.
yeah.
I have to say,
And it is a dystopia of disability, of being made blind. It is one of the most frightening books I have ever read, but it is also one of the most empathetic novels, I think, that I've ever read. And there's this wonderful development of reliance between people in that novel that I think is quite startling, the humanity in that book. So that is an example of a
There's also
dystopia.
quite a bit of science fiction that introduces a disability,
Yes.
like humanity has lost the ability to feel, for example, or go the other way. We've overcompensated to remove disabilities, so now we're all cyborgs. You know, like Ghost in the Shell, that kind of idea that we've lost our identity.
The superhero genre as well, in some ways. Like,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of superhero stories are told in this way of these people are being hunted or oppressed because of their different abilities to so-called normal people.
and another writer who's dealt with that is John Wyndham. So when you mentioned blindness, of course, I immediately thought of Day of the Triffids.
Absolutely.
You know, but also he wrote a novel called The Chrysalids, where people were being oppressed for having a different ability. So yeah, it is explored a lot, I think. Great question.
Has that ever
Yeah.
been made into a film? It's like
Well, I don't know.
it's one of my favourite books that I think is not a film, and I sort of hope it doesn't get made into a film.
John Wyndham got very criticised for writing cosy catastrophes, it was called, and I think that almost brings us back to that idea of the pleasure of the idea of the apocalypse. Day of the Triffids definitely has that.
And the apocalypse genre can also be... I'm sorry, I'm segueing into a whole nother panel. I'll shut up.
3 minutes, it's fine.
I was just thinking we haven't mentioned On the Beach, and I think that is a utopian post-apocalypse
But
where everyone's just terribly polite to everyone else and then dies.
I mean, I guess when I use the word sublime, I'm really kind of using it in that very old-fashioned Edmund Burke aesthetic idea that the sublime, which has nothing to do with the beautiful, is what inspires terror and awe at the same time. And I think one of the reasons we talk now about the technological sublime, the apocalyptic sublime, which also goes back to religious art, of course, there's a lot of religious paintings and, you know, which show the destruction of, you know, the actual apocalypse as described in the Bible, which we now have transferred to nuclear war, etc. We even now have a toxic sublime, where, you know, the oceans are getting overwhelmed by plastic and we get these kind of chemical sunsets, etc. And I think that relates to our terror now of feeling, I think, you know, it relates to this terror that we have now that if this is the Anthropocene, that we're the greatest power we're facing instead of nature.
I'd like to see a decent Lovecraft adaptation.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I think Spring by Justin Benson and Aaron Morehouse. It's not an adaptation, but it's riffing on Lovecraftian mythology. So is Andrei Zulawski's Possession from 1981, and The Untamed by Amat Escalante that's playing at MIFF. I think these films all riff on Lovecraftian mythology, but I would like to see balls to the wall, tits out, straight up, decent Lovecraft adaptation.
I think there's actually one in the works, but like every other one that's come before it, I have very low expectations because they've all been terrible.
There was an okay one of the colour
The
of...
okayest adaptation.
There's the okayest is a German film called Die Farbe, which is the colour of... I can't remember the Lovecraft story, the colour of something.
Colour of Space.
Thank you, The Colour
Out
of Space. And it's a very low-budget German film called Die Farbe, and it's it just moves from black and white to colour, but that's the closest that I've ever got.
Well, I'll go very old and say C.S. Lewis's extraordinary science fiction, particularly Voyage to Venus, which has these insane descriptions of his fantastical landscapes of Venus, where there's islands that float on the water and magical trees and stuff. I don't know who I'd want to do it. Maybe it's already kind of been done in a way by Cameron and Avatar with those incredible landscapes. I'm not sure.
I'm going to do what I did last time and take the low road on this one. Go back to my games design roots. There was a role-playing game from the early 90s called Riffs, which almost became a film through Bruckheimer, and thankfully didn't. I think it was going to be a Michael Bay film at one point, and Nicolas Cage was involved. I am friends with and personally involved with the creator of it, and I remember how excited he was at the money flashing before his eyes, and then he realized what a horrible shit show it was going to turn into, and he retracted. But the ability to pick that up and work with that again would be... so to answer the other part of the question is, who would make it? Me.
I believe that Charlotte Wood's novel, The Natural Way of Things, is being made into a film as we speak. I'm excited for it, but I also am a little nervous because I know that there's a history of films about violence against women and entrapment that can be very exploitative, and so I'm watching for that one personally.
God damn it, I didn't even think of my own first book, which is being optioned by an American company, which I can't name. I want that to be made.
For reasons.
Because of reasons. What's the book? It's called When We Have Wings. So supposedly they want to make a TV series of it. I hope they do.
Also, I'd love to see someone try and write a novel about a novel version of Mad Max.
Nice. Cool. Well, it is time to end the panel. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Hey, thank you.